Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Bonds and Stories, we retell those moments honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The first word that truly landed wasn't a word so much as a verdict. Liar. It fell out of my sister's mouth with a brittle little tremor, and in the same instant the stem of my glass slipped in my palm. Red wine leapt across the linen like a slashed ribbon. The crack of crystal on tile rang out, and then nothing. No clatter of silver, no chair scrape, just a silence that seemed to have weight. Sabrina stood at the head of the table, a lacquered finger aimed squarely at my chest like a magistrate's baton. "You've wanted what's mine since we were children," she said, voice bright with fury. "You can't stand it if I have something first." I could feel the old house holding its breath around us, the oil portraits watching the grandfather clock refusing to tick. My father, Charles, a man who could talk a jury into believing the sun rose in the west, stared at his napkin as though it contained case law. My mother, Margot, wore the perfectly composed expression she kept for garden tours and charity luncheons, while a pulse beat in her temple. Down the table, my younger sister, Lena, didn't move at all. She was 16, then all elbows and eyes a deer poised to bolt. "Sabrina," I said, hearing how small my voice sounded in that elegant room. "He didn't know you, felt that way. You told me he was a friend." "Don't," she snapped, and the syllable was sharp enough to cut. "Don't pretend you didn't understand. You waited until I brought him into our home, and then you slid in like you always do, smiling, quiet, helpful, and you took him." She said took as though I had shoplifted a brooch. There are some moments when the geometry of a family tilts. Chairs, portraits, old stories, everything shifts half an inch, and you realize the picture you've been living inside was never quite straight. We were the Hales of Greenwich, the sort of family people described as polished. It turns out polish is only the glow that heat leaves on metal after hammering it thin. I didn't take anyone, I said. Ethan and I don't want to hear his name. Sabrina drew in a breath that trembled and then smoothed itself. "You will choose," she announced, not to me, but to our parents, as if I weren't even seated there. Her or me. I won't breathe the same air as a sister who would betray me. The word betray wasn't new to our house. It lived in those portraits' ancestors who crossed oceans or cousins who married beneath them. But to hear it pointed at me, hung like a millstone around my neck, was to discover how cold old paint could be. No one spoke. In the silence, I could hear my blood an ocean in my ears. My father cleared his throat, hunting for neutral ground, the way he did when judges frowned, but whatever sentence he'd been preparing dissolved. My mother looked down at the tablecloth where the wine had spread in a starburst, and I thought absurdly that she was trying to calculate whether it could still be salvaged. "Clara," she said at last, using the tone reserved for half-truths and thank-you notes, "this isn't the night for a scene." She lifted her gaze to meet mine. It was a steady look, careful, something practiced. "Perhaps it would be best if you didn't come by for a while, until everyone has cooled off. There are phrases designed like velvet soft to the touch, deafening in meaning." That one unhooked me from the table. The chair still held the shape of my body as I stood. I could have said everything, that I had been the child who learned neighbors' birthdays and laid out plates after dinner, the one who minded the cat and the thermostat, and all the forgotten things no one notices until they stop happening. That Sabrina had called Ethan Rowe my friend, showing him around my father's firm with a possessive lift to her chin, and then drifted away after the next charity gala. That he and I were the ones who stayed to talk in a quiet corner, where the AC sighed about a novel he loved, a blues record my father wouldn't let me play in the living room. That I should have told her once we'd exchanged numbers, but I didn't, because I was tired of being cast in a minor role in a play whose ending I didn't choose. I could have said every one of those sentences, and maybe it would have changed nothing. "I'll go," I said instead. The room exhaled the way rooms do when a storm shifts before the rain hits. I bent, gathering the glittering crescent of the broken glass stem, and set it down a moon on the charger plate. No one stopped me in the hall. The entry mirror caught my reflection and made it thinner. I took my coat and the night swallowed me fragrant with boxwood and the sea 30 minutes away. It would be comforting to pretend that what happened at that table was a single bad evening. But avalanches are not caused by one snowflake. They require a certain slope carved over years. I am the middle daughter, the person people forget to count when they say a family of 4 and mean 2 parents plus the eldest and the youngest. Sabrina, 3 years older, learned early that the spotlight enjoys being asked. Lena, 8 years younger, had the gravity of the adored. I lived in the reliable margin keeper of calendars, finder of keys, the first to stand up when someone said, "Would anyone mind?" I met Ethan the summer I turned 22. He was handsome in that unassuming way that makes you trust a face. Earnest eyes, the ghost of dimples, tie always a little crooked. He arrived at Whitman and Daughtry, my father's firm, as a summer associate, and it was Sabrina who installed herself as his tour guide, flitting in and out of glass-walled conference rooms with him drifting a step behind. I went along one Friday when she announced we were educating the new blood at a backyard cookout, and Ethan and I somehow ended up refilling ice together. "I'm still trying to learn the difference between what people here say and what they mean," he joked. "I grew up fluent," I said, and he laughed not at me, but with me, which felt like a door I didn't know was locked, swinging open. We talked that evening in the garden, the light going molten through the hydrangeas. He liked used bookstores. I liked annotating margins. He believed in timetables. I believed in departure boards. He asked for my number near the back steps not as a dare, but like it was an ordinary thing to want. It should have been simple to tell Sabrina I planned to see him again. I opened my mouth to say it twice that weekend, and shut it when she launched into stories of a partner's yacht and a judge's temper, and how Ethan remembered the name of the court clerk's terrier. The first date became a second, and the second unraveled into weeks. We were careful. We didn't go to places where my parents' friends would nod over oysters. We ate noodles standing up by a fogged window and argued about which version of Hallelujah actually worked. We were happy, and the happiness looked small and plain from far away, a pottery mug, not a champagne flute, and I loved it for that. I wish I could say I confessed before anyone found us out. I didn't. I delayed thinking I could write the right script for Sabrina's entrance. The script wrote itself without me. A friend of a friend saw us in a secondhand record store off Elm, and 3 days later, the story arrived at our front door dressed in someone else's outrage. The confrontation at dinner was relentless, not because it was loud, but because it was tidy. Sabrina never once smeared her mascara. My father never raised his voice. My mother only pressed her napkin into her palm until the hem left little squares on her skin. They did not slam doors or throw salt shakers. They did not say, "Get out." They said, "Let's be sensible and give it time, and this is not how our family handles things." Sensible, timed, handled gentle, absolute verbs. A week later, my house key stopped turning in the lock. The locksmith came at noon, the same man who had put the brass plate on the front door when I was 8, and we were upgrading the look. He didn't meet my eye. My father sent a message through my mother, something about space, about avoiding scenes. The friends who used to share rides to Pilates class somehow never saw my texts. Invitations thinned, and then they stopped trying to find me at all. Families rarely say we are erasing you now. They simply fold around the gap, and the fold looks like design. I packed in a hurry at first, 2 suitcases, the books I could not leave behind, a shoebox of photographs that smelled faintly of old cedar. Then I sat cross-legged in the center of my small bedroom, the one without a lock on the door. Finally understanding that childhood had ended, not with diplomas and toasts, but with a sentence spoken in an even voice over a red stain on linen. When I closed the lid on the last box, I paused. The sounds of the house rose up to meet me. Water in the walls, a pipe tapping a floorboard that always answered back in the 3rd step from the landing. I imagine there are rooms that remember where their people went. I touched the doorway with my fingertips, the way I used to touch it when I measured my height with a pencil. I left by the side entrance. The hydrangeas were blue and enormous that year, absurd in their abundance, as if the soil had decided to be generous to prove a point. I carried my suitcases to the curb and waited for the cab I had ordered under a name that wasn't quite mine. The driver didn't ask questions. We drove past the club where my parents danced in June, past the green where the town pretended it hadn't changed since 1950, and toward the highway that would make our streets into an afterthought. If anyone had looked up from their salmon that night, they might have seen a woman in a brown coat step into a taxi with 2 battered bags and a shoebox she refused to let the driver touch. They would not have recognized me. That is the trouble with the middle daughter. When she is gone, the table still seats 4, and yet, I was not gone. I was only out of view. The cab hummed down I-95 like a dark insect, and the farther the tail light slid from that house, the easier it became to breathe. At the airport, I bought a ticket under my own name because I was finished pretending to be anyone else, and by noon the next day I was walking into a mist that smelled faintly of cedar and ocean Portland. Ethan met me at baggage claim with a paper cup of coffee and the kind of quiet a person can sit down inside. He didn't ask what had been said. He didn't ask why my hands shook when I signed the receipt for the taxi. He opened the trunk and waited for me to decide whether the shoebox of photographs should ride in the back seat with me or could bear being shut away. I put it on my knees. He drove us across a short bridge into a neighborhood of clapboard houses and maples that in summer looked as if they were perpetually telling a joke. His apartment was small enough that the kettle made itself heard from every room, and the front window framed a slice of street where a woman in a yellow raincoat stood each morning for the bus. We made a space in the closet for my 2 suitcases, and then we made dinner out of what the cupboard had to offer: eggs toast, a tomato that tasted of anything but travel, and I slept with the shoebox under the bed as if secrets could be broken into. Portland has a way of teaching you scale. In Greenwich, the sky was a ceiling designed by someone with opinions. Here, it was a weather that did not care whether you owned anything. On the 3rd day when the fog lifted, the buildings seemed to step forward like people who were shy at first, and then remembered they were allowed to join the conversation. I walked. I learned the corners where bakeries perfumed the air, the thrift store where the clothes smelled of lavender, the bookstore that stacked the new arrivals near a heater that clicked like a metronome. I learned to say good morning to strangers. I learned not to look for a mirror. Practical things insisted on being done. I needed work. Ethan suggested a dozen places, but the suggestion he barely made at all is the one that stuck Rowe and Calder Architects. His father, Daniel Rowe, had founded the firm with a partner who wore wooden cufflinks and refused to buy cheap pencils. Their office sat in a converted cannery with brick walls and enormous windows. The conference table was a slab of old bowling lane. The receptionist gave me a clipboard with a pen that worked better than anything I had used in my father's building. They didn't have a position posted. They did, however, have a long list of clients who wanted different things for contradictory reasons, and a staff of talented people who did not always enjoy the genre known as explanation. I'm good at reasons, I told Daniel when he asked what it was that I did. I'm good at remembering the thing a person wants before they remember to say it out loud. We call that client services, he said, and then a rescue depending on the week. It turned out to be both. I learned how many ways a person could panic about a kitchen island. I learned that churches and breweries have the same fights about parking. I learned that if you listen long enough, a complaint walks itself back to the first room it was ever uttered in. I put together packets that translated drawings into English called a client's mother to assure her her son had not been hypnotized by a modernist cult, sent flowers to the neighbor who had not been warned about a demolition. Within 6 months, I knew the names of everyone's dogs and which client would call exactly 11 minutes after closing time, as if that did not count as after. 2 years in the firm had doubled its active projects, and Daniel slid a new business card across the table toward me. Director of Client Operations looked theatrical to me, but it was theater with substance, schedules that respected the world beyond them, budgets that we wrote in a language both sides could pronounce. That was when I met Maeve Hartley. She arrived in a navy coat the color of late water, and a temper that was not so much short as efficiently expressed. She was the operations chief of a mid-sized tech company that had grown like a weed, and then discovered that weeds can be strong and still need a stake. They wanted a new headquarters, a showcase without a show. I toured Maeve through the cannery as if it were ours, and she watched me watch her team. Later she said, "You anticipate theater, like someone who has sat in the next room while the actors rehearse." "We were a family of rehearsals," I said. "And you were backstage," she replied, not unkindly. The project closed on an unremarkable Tuesday. Maeve took me for coffee in a place that made espresso taste like a homework assignment you were happy to complete. "You're wasted on kitchens and parking lots," she said, not as an insult to Rowe and Calder, but as if she were pointing out a door I might not have noticed. "I like kitchens," I said, and I meant it. "I like people. People are the work," she said. "All the time." even when they tell you they are not. We met again 2 months later, then again, and then she did what Maeve always does. When she has correctly identified a thing, she gave it a name and a date. Hartley Hale Strategies began inside a rented room with 2 desks, a whiteboard that came with a mysterious smear in the lower right corner, and a printer that wheezed like a small animal. Maeve brought discipline welded to kindness. I brought a fluency in crises, and a Rolodex that grew every time I answered a phone call no one wanted to make. The first clients were not glamorous. A regional grocer had a listeria scare that wasn't. A small college president used words at a podium that ricocheted around the internet because the wind was wrong, and so was the day. We triaged, we mapped, we explained. We taught adults the difference between apology and admission. We examined policies that had been written when people thought the fax machine would be president forever. We did not lie for anyone. We simply helped them tell the truth in a way the world could parse without burning down the usable parts of a life. The work multiplied. Someone who had served a governor remembered the woman who called his mother after a snowstorm knocked out the heat at the State House Annex. A musician's manager had heard that we could keep the emergency inside the room where it belonged instead of letting it slosh onto the sidewalk. We hired analysts who could find the thread in the tangle. We hired an IT director who wore cardigans and spoke softly and could make servers sit up straight when they didn't feel like it. Money, which had frightened me as a vocabulary in my father's house, became a set of numbers that represented obligations and possibilities. When our accountant ran the year-end report for the first time, and the totals stacked like tidy bricks, I felt something complicated unspool in my chest. We put profit back into the business and called it prudence because that sounded better than fear. We opened a second office near a river that thought it was the main character. We opened a third in a city where everyone cheered for a team that never won when they should. We learned how to carry a reputation like a fragile bowl, not with fear, but with respect for what it held. I married Ethan. We did it in a room with windows and no aisle because I did not want to be walked anywhere by anyone. My dress was a pale gray that made my mother's voice in my head briefly lose signal, and Danielle from the firm made a cake that held together like a good plan. We invited exactly the number of people we could feed without pretending. Lena sent a handwritten note on heavy paper and signed it with a flourish she had invented in 7th grade. I traced it with my thumb and set it in a drawer where I kept things I could look at without bleeding. I did not look back very often. When I did, it was not to long for anything. It was habit like checking a lock. In my line of work, I began to understand that knowing what might explode is not cynicism, it is housekeeping. I started small, a news alert here, a glance at a legal database there. When a politician's staffer mentioned my family at a fundraiser offhand, like someone noting the weather, I felt a shiver of the old world pass through a room I had designed to keep that climate out. I hired a private investigator, the way a person hires a piano tuner. Once you own the instrument, it is foolish to pretend you can make it true without help. His name was Noah Mercer. He was not grand. He wore ordinary shoes and asked permission before he sat in a chair. In his reports, the drama was placed precisely where it belonged, which is to say rarely at the center. He did not stalk anyone. He read records. He noticed the shape of paper trails. He kept his verbs calm. I told him exactly what I wanted and what I would never use anything for. He nodded as if I had merely confirmed a rule he already believed in. At first, he tracked the mentions of my name that were not mine, because Clara Hale belongs to more than one woman in America, and some of those women were very busy online. Later, I asked him to make a quarterly file on the people who used to make decisions about my life without asking me to stand in the room while they did it. The file did not grow loud. It grew thorough. It noted the charities where my mother spoke the cases my father cited at conferences, the clubs where Sabrina learned to be the kind of person whose picture explains a caption. It noted that Lena, who once refused to speak because she didn't like the way the word vacuum moved in her mouth, had become an interviewer who made other people sound like the better versions of themselves. It noted small lies, the kind that people tell themselves about their time and their temper and their tax deductions. It noted nothing about me, which was the point. The morning the invitation arrived, the mail was late, and the light was sparse. It slid under my office door as if it were embarrassed to be seen, and landed beside the rubber plant that had pretended to die twice already, and then decided to live. The envelope was cream in the way cream only is if you intend to be noticed holding it. The script whispered money. When I turned it over, a monogram shone in gold as if someone had buffed it by hand, S&J. Inside, on heavy stock, were the names Sabrina Hale and Julian Caraway III requested the honor of everything. The date was set for early summer, the venue a private club, whose lawn believed it had been born in England. A smaller card written in Margot's exacting hand said, "Family is forever. We hope you're well, dear. Portland must be charming. It would mean the world if you could attend." I read it twice. Then I read it again for the words that were not there. I did not call. I walked to the window and watched a school group cross the street with a teacher who had clearly counted and counted again. I poured myself water as if I were someone in a play buying time. The invitation was a gesture, but it was also a signal. Signals are not requests. They are declarations dressed in nice paper. In the afternoon, I typed Caraway Family Trust into a subscription database. Then I typed Caraway Foundation Charter. Caraway Holdings Governance. Julian Caraway Board Minutes. Caraway plus clause. I read, "There is a language wealthy families use when they talk to themselves about risk." I had become fluent in it by necessity. The Caraway Trust was elegantly structured as if you could make money behave by seating it correctly at dinner. There it was on page 6 of a document that did not expect to be read by anyone who cried at movies. Beneficiaries shall maintain conduct commensurate with the reputation of the family and its philanthropic aims. The sentence looked harmless, like a fence around a field that is mostly fog. It was not harmless at all. Noah had a manila folder on my desk by the next morning. Outline, he said, the sort you like. The summary included a family tree with arrows where the branches had been grafted. A list of holdings that preferred to be mentioned in generalities and notes on the ways the Caraways dealt with trouble discretion when they could buy at distance when they could not. Noah had done nothing illegal to acquire any of it. Paper wants to be seen by the right eyes, and money leaves fingerprints on every surface it tries to avoid. I do not keep trophies, I keep documents. I slid the invitation into the front pocket of a leather folio that had once belonged to an accountant who mailed us his last invoice with a handwritten note that said, "I'm retiring to a lake, wish me luck." Behind it, I filed a recent annual report printed on thick stock that did not smudge a short case list with the names redacted to initials because discretion begins at home. A briefing note that translated the Caraway clause into simple English and then into the dialect journalists use when they are twice as cautious as they are hungry. Ethan saw the envelope on the counter that night while we made dinner. He read it, put it down, and asked whether I had salt. After we ate, he washed the pans and I dried them, and only then did he say, "Does this feel like an invitation? Or like a test?" "Both," I said. He nodded, as if two things being true at once had never frightened him. He touched my wrist. "Do you want to go?" "Yes." "Do you need to?" "No." He smiled like someone who had won a small argument with himself. "Then it's a yes," he said, and went to put the kettle on. In bed, I held the folio against my chest like a shield that did not look like one. I did not make speeches in my head. I didn't write anyone's lines. I thought about a lawn that had never met England, about a staircase where photographs would be staged, about rooms that introduced people to one another, as if they were invented that very morning. I thought about Lena's note in the drawer, and about the way fog burns off water when the day decides to commit to itself. The week before the date printed in gold, I sent 3 emails. One to our operations lead, a schedule that ensured the phones would be manned and the inbox watched, that decisions could be made without me until I sat back down. One to Noah, a final check of public records for last-minute filings that have a way of announcing themselves when people think no one is looking. One to myself, which is to say to the part of me that used to leave rooms whenever someone declared a crisis. It contained 4 lines. Bring the invitation. Bring the brief. Bring the report. Bring your name. On the morning I packed the plant by the window, looked greener than it had any right to be. I folded the navy dress I had chosen because it made me feel as if I understood a sentence before it finished. I set the folio on top so it would be the first thing my hand found. When I closed the suitcase, the latch clicked the way a good plan clicks, not dramatically, not even audibly to someone in the next room, but with a correctness that you can feel in your palm. I locked the office door. In the hallway, the cleaners were debating whether the glass doors smudged more on Tuesdays or Thursdays. Outside, the air had that clean smell Portland sometimes wears, as if it has just put on a new shirt. I walked to the corner and waited for the car that would take me to the airport, and when it came, I opened the door myself. The plane rose through a layer of cloud that looked arranged by a careful hand, and then leveled into a blue so uncomplicated it felt like a trick. I read 3 pages of a magazine I didn't want, and watched a flight attendant make coffee with a practiced tenderness I envied. Somewhere over the Midwest, I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the map showed a small plane icon skimming toward a coast whose outline I knew by heart. Hartford met me with sun that looked polished from use. I signed for a rental under the name on my license. Hale, the word that used to unlock doors, and drove south on a highway that remembered me. The radio tried to sell me lawn care and trust. I turned it off and let the tires write their looping logic against the asphalt. The salt marshes arrived without warning, flat and pale and open, and then the hedges began clipped into shapes that said the people behind them preferred their seasons measured. The club had been built to pretend to be older than the trees. Its white facade held that specific white that money buys the shade that does not admit that rain has a color. A man at the gatehouse wore a blazer as if he had grown up inside one. I rolled down my window. He took the invitation, read it, and watched the muscles in his face decide on a response. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hale," he said, voice quiet enough to make me lean forward. "Your name isn't on the final list." He waited for the scene he had been trained to manage. Indignation, pleading the phrase, "Do you know who I am?" I gave him a different sentence. "Would you please let the event coordinator know that Clara Hale is here?" I handed him the second card. It was not ornate. It was a rectangle of matte stock with my name and title in black letters, and my firm's smaller name beneath like a shadow that knew how to hold its line. He didn't look at me again while he spoke into the phone. He looked at the card as if it were something breakable. A small, not another. The gate opened with a soft hydraulic certainty. The drive curved through clipped green obedience to a circle of gravel that sparkled faintly as if someone had thought of adding sugar. A valet in a navy cap took the keys, as if the car and I were both things that needed to be handled lightly. From the portico, I could see into a foyer that had been designed to teach you how to walk slower. The cocktail hour had already begun. Women in dresses that refracted the light the way water does. Men in suits that looked comfortable not because they fit, but because they were used to being worn. A quartet played something low and competent. The air held cold air conditioning and a suggestion of lilies. Clara. The voice began in surprise and tripped into relief. Lena moved toward me so quickly her earrings caught the light, a small scatter of brightness. She hugged me with both arms, then drew back to take in my dress, my face, my presence like someone memorizing a painting in case it is taken down. "You look," she stopped herself before saying beautiful, the way a child stops herself from running on a slick floor. "You look like yourself." "I am myself," I said, letting the obviousness be a kindness. "Mom's with the bridal party," she said. "Dad's trying to keep Julian's grandfather away from the bartender. There's a photograph set up on the East Terrace because of course there is, and—" She lowered her voice. "I'm glad you came." "Thank you," I said. It was a sentence I could offer without carving anything else away. Across the room, I felt eyes touch and withdraw. Recognition is a social sport. In towns like ours, a glance lands, a whisper follows, and the whisper breeds implications. I could almost hear the math. "That's the middle one, the one who—" and then their sentences ran out because they had filed me undergone and had not left room for an update. "Ms. Hale." A man with a lapel pin that wanted to be a heraldry badge interrupted our sister's gravity. He had the posture of someone who arranges other people for a living. "If you would allow me to escort you to the family anteroom," I nodded, and followed him through a corridor lined with photographs of men standing near boats that had never seen weather. We passed a parlor where a teenager practiced not slouching in a tuxedo, a powder room that smelled of violets and management. The anteroom door stood ajar. Inside, the temperature was lower by at least 2 degrees, and conversation had the crispness of paper. My mother turned when she heard the door, and simultaneously saw me and disguised that scene. Her pearls lay exactly where they always lay against her collarbone, a string of little assurances. "Clara," she said, as if approving a seating arrangement. "Portland must agree with you." "It does," I said. My father looked as if someone had changed a page in his notes. "You made it," he said, like a verdict, and then flinched at his own choice of word. Sabrina stood where the light from a tall window could find her. The dress suited her. Of course it did. She held a bouquet of white peonies that had been told to behave. When her eyes landed on me, they did not blaze. They assessed. She brought the bouquet down a fraction enough to put 1 more inch of air between her and the flowers, and her mouth worked once as if forming a letter. "Clara," she said, and the second syllable thinned. "Sabrina," I answered. "Congratulations." "Thank you." She exhaled, and for a sliver of a second, I could see the rehearsal beneath the performance, the folded-up map of contingency plans, the list of names, and their ranked importance, the tidy column labeled optics. The second passed. Julian arrived like an advertisement for the word eligible, square-jawed, well-tailored, the kind of confident that believes in itself even when alone. He shook my father's hand, kissed my mother's cheek without smudging anything, turned to me with a smile he had learned at schools that teach you to smile. "We're so pleased you could join us," he said. "Sabrina told me you might." "She's good at outcomes," I said. His smile held. A person like Julian knows that vague phrases are safest when applied generously. "Today is for good feelings," he said. "Feelings are very cooperative when given clear instructions," I said. Lena pressed her mouth so it would not become a grin. A man entered then, whom the room's air seemed to recognize before his name arrived. Silver hair, the slow gait of wealth that has never needed to hurry. "Is this her?" He asked no one and everyone, Sabrina's sister. My father shifted to intercept. "Yes, Mr. Carraway," he began. "This is Clara." Clara Hale, the older man said directly to me and extended a hand. "I am Julian's grandfather. I do not like surprises at events with photographers, but I hate dullness more." "Sir," I said, taking the hand. It was dry and brief and calculated. Everything in the room was calculated. "Are you in the law?" he asked, the way men of his generation ask where you went to school to locate you on a map where they already own the buildings. "I'm in strategy," I said. "Crisis work. Communication." "Ah," he said, as if we were discussing footwear. "Useful when people cannot keep their appetites to themselves. Useful when people forget that sentences have subjects," I said mildly. He looked almost pleased and then remembered not to be. "Enjoy the evening," he said. "And do enjoy it. We can't have you being seen not enjoying it." He moved on, taking the room's pressure with him like weather. Sabrina watched him go with a concentration that made me think of heat shimmering above a road. Then she addressed me without moving toward me. "I'm glad you came," she said, and it was the sort of sentence laid down like tile, neat, adhesive, and personal. "Family is family." I looked at the bouquet she held between us like an occupied seat. Sometimes I said because it was as much as the room would bear. There were photographs to be taken. A junior coordinator with a headset spoke in commas and ushered us through a series of poses that had names. Parents with bride, siblings. Bride with matron of honor, even though there was no matron of honor, because Sabrina had decided that the title aged people. My mother kept checking her left side the way she did in every mirror. My father searched for his best man smile and found his courtroom one instead. In the frame where the 3 sisters were meant to appear, Lena stepped to the center without negotiating and placed her hand against my shoulder in a way that neither encouraged nor hid. Sabrina's bouquet edged in like shoreline. "Lovely," the photographer said, and took 4 frames as if the light might change its mind. On the terrace, canapés circulated with the grace of professionals who can do their work sleeping. A woman I remembered from piano recitals asked me where I was living now, as if the geography might be temporary. A man I didn't know told me he had read about my firm in somewhere or other. He waved a hand at the idea of publication, and that he found our whole business very modern. I smiled the way one smiles when someone pronounces a word incorrectly with vigor. In the West drawing room, where they had set a bar with bottles that believed in their pedigree, I met Julian's mother, a woman whose posture had been trained by equestrian lessons and expectations. She wore a dress the color of the inside of a seashell, and a look that never wholly departed from skepticism. "My son speaks highly of your husband," she said. "Architecture is soothing. It is good to build something that stays." "It is," I said, "even when the thing that stays is not visible." She inclined her head as if I had admitted to a principle, and then catalogued it. "I hope today is civilized," she said. The pause was placed correctly between the word and what she meant it to cover. "So do I said. Lena found me again, as the light melted into a version of itself that the brochures always promise. "You're doing well," she said under the music. "I'm standing up," I said. "It's a start." She bit her lip, an old habit reclaimed. "They crossed your name off the guest list yesterday," she said. "I saw the coordinator's clipboard. Dad told her you had declined. He said it was better for everyone." "That must have been calming," I said, "and the dryness surprised even me." I argued, she said. "I didn't win. I am not an only child." She breathed out. "I'm sorry." "It's not yours to fix," I said. She nodded a small adult nod that belonged to no one but her. I excused myself then, and found the ladies' lounge a room upholstered as if clouds had been domesticated and trained to accept furniture. I stood at the sink and washed my hands longer than necessary, not because they needed it, but because running water is one of the few honest sounds in places like this. I opened the leather folio and checked pointless reassuring that the invitation was still tucked in the front, that the case list still bore its careful initials, that the brief still translated a clause into the sort of English that refuses to be misunderstood. When I returned to the main room, the quartet had shifted to a piece people recognized without being able to name. The event coordinator glided by with a clipboard that looked like a passport. "Ms. Hale," she murmured. Not stopping, "They'll be introducing the families in 5 minutes." "Thank you," I said, and watched a waiter carry a tray of champagne like a small galaxy through the door to the foyer. Near the base of the great staircase, the one that curled up and around as if the house were spelling its own name, I caught sight of my father speaking with a man from his firm. His hands moved in arguments, gentle ones, the kind that never quite land. My mother had stationed herself at the entrance to the grand salon and was steering distant relatives with the precision of a harbor pilot. Sabrina stood 3 steps up, which placed her slightly above everyone, without giving the impression she had chosen the height. I felt in the bones behind my ribs the old geometry of this house, where sound carried, where eyes naturally traveled, where a person might stand and be seen not as an accident, but as a fact. I rested my hand on the banister. The wood was so polished it felt like something to be refused. The quartet paused. A small chime sounded delicate and insistent. Conversations broke neatly like sugar glass. The event coordinator lifted her hand and smiled her professional smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the room's hush, "if you'll please join us in welcoming the families of the bride and groom. The families of the bride and groom." The coordinator's voice held the room with ribbons you couldn't see. People turned the way flowers do when light moves. I stood at the base of the staircase with my hand on the banister, feeling the varnish turn cool under my skin. They began with the expected. Caraway's first in order of donor plaque, then Hale's arranged by the old choreography father at the center, mother to his right eldest daughter in the air that belongs to her. Lena and I were asked forward together. Flash, flash, polite brightness controlled applause. When the clapping thinned, the quartet resumed and the floor shifted from attention to arrangement. I waited for the room to release its held breath. It didn't. It changed it. Julian's grandfather moved as if he'd decided the air should be different. He reached the base of the staircase, looked up past Sabrina's shoulder to the mezzanine, where cameras crouched like discreet birds, then turned to me. "Ms. Hale," he said, low enough not to carry, and loud enough to matter. "You are what, in the business of preventing fires? In the business of keeping doors from slamming when they don't have to," I said, "and lighting them when they do." He allowed himself half an old man's smile. "Name of your firm." I could have given the short answer. I gave the precise one, clear and ordinary enough to be quoted without decoration. "Hartley Hale Strategies," I said. "Senior partner." The syllables went out like a stone dropped in a still pond. You could feel where they landed, even if you didn't watch the ripples. A man at the bar paused with a lemon twist in his hand. A woman by the gallery door repeated the name to herself, testing it, as if it were a password she'd forgotten she knew. Recognition doesn't shout in rooms like this. It locates. "Ah," said the grandfather, not surprised, simply satisfied. "The governor's snowstorm, the health system with the unhelpful chart." The musician who learned to count to 3 before he spoke. He wasn't asking. He was arranging files in a drawer he kept behind his eyes. Among others, I said. He looked up at the mezzanine, where the photographers waited for cues that would let them call moments candid, then back to me. You aren't on the list, he said, almost amused now. I brought my own, I said, and offered the invitation from the folio. His gaze skimmed it only long enough to confirm the gold was real. I set a business card on top of the paper like a paperweight. He didn't touch it. His generation is practiced at letting eager people pick their offerings back up. But he made the smallest gesture of assent, which in that room amounted to a stamped visa. Welcome, he said. Do enjoy the party. He moved away. The coordinator resumed her gentle choreography. The quartet found a melody people could hum without remembering when they first learned it. And yet the weather was new. It showed in the way conversations oriented themselves, as if I were a compass that had been corrected. It showed in the glance my father cast toward the head table, the reflexive calculation in my mother's mouth as she recomputed where to stand. Sabrina descended the last 3 steps. The bouquet had become an accessory instead of a barricade. You didn't need to, she began and stopped, because a sentence beginning with you didn't need always makes its own accusation. I brought what was asked for, I said. An invitation. Her eyes flicked to the card I'd left on the folio. And a name. I've had one for some time. A server slid between us with a tray of champagne. Sabrina took a glass and looked at the bubbles as if they required instruction. Let's keep today pleasant, she said, and the word pleasant sat there like a folded napkin you weren't allowed to use. That's up to the room, I said. The toasts began. A best man with witty restraint. A maid of honor who did voice a fraction higher than her own and pronounced ineffable with an extra syllable. Laughter in the right places. The clink and glide of knives across plates. I sat at a table that believed in the idea of cousins people whose names you half remember and whose histories recur like a chorus. Lena was on my left. Across from us, a woman I'd last seen judging a high school debate round leaned in to tell me the salmon was much kinder than expected, as if kindness were a property of fish. My father rose for his toast with the authority of a man who is listened to. He spoke about families binding themselves to one another with promises that outlast small variables, and the room applauded the theorem without checking the proof. When he sat, he looked his age and then hid it in a sip of water. Between courses, Julian's mother approached as if we were already mid-conversation. Mr. Carroway says you run the firm with the calm press likes to call savvy, she said. Our foundation has complexities. Most do, I said. She glanced quick and appreciative at the way I didn't fill the space beyond that. Would you be open to a conversation, she asked, and used no adjectives to gild the request. Yes, I said. You can reach me through this address. I slid a card to the linen's edge. She didn't read it. She knew how to have things read for her. She nodded as if we'd finished solving a proof and moved on before anyone mistook the moment for a pitch. Across the table, a cousin whispered, "Is that the firm that did the hospital thing?" And another said I thought she moved to the Pacific Northwest to make pottery, which was somehow the kindest rumor anyone had devised. In the pause before the cake, my mother found me. Up close under the powder and pearls, her eyes looked tired, not from the day, but from the strain of holding an expression in place for so many years without letting it be touched. Clara, she said, and the name wobbled once before landing. You've built something. I have, I said. We always hoped you were safe. She breathed as if she'd been permitted to return to sea level. There were misunderstandings. There were decisions, I said. She flinched faintly and covered the movement with a small adjustment of a bracelet. Your dress is very flattering, she said, and the compliment and the retreat were the same action. Thank you, I said. She looked past my shoulder at the photographers. Smile, darling, she whispered reflexively. The old instruction, the old love language. I did not. The cake was cut with an heirloom knife that had never seen a kitchen. People crowded, exclaiming as if sugar performed a magic no one had encountered before. I stepped out onto the terrace. Evening had finally committed to itself. The hedges threw long, honest shadows. Somewhere beyond the lawn, a boat spoke in a muted horn. Lena joined me, her shawl half off one shoulder. How are you holding up? She asked, not as a figure of speech. As if this house and I signed a temporary treaty, I said. She laughed softly. You always make rooms sound like nations. She tucked the shawl into place. They told the coordinator you declined, she said again, as if saying it twice might move it through her body and out. I saw the clipboard. I told her it wasn't true. I know I said. I heard you in the way she said my name. She leaned her elbows on the stone and looked out. Do you and I get to start over? She asked, eyes still on the lawn. Not the kind where people declare it and do nothing differently. I mean the kind that involves Tuesdays and texts, and the annoyance of having to show up when you're tired. Yes, I said, if we're both willing to be tired sometimes. Deal, she said, and offered her hand like we were 10 and 8 and founding a club. I shook it. She kept it an extra heartbeat. Inside, a cluster of guests had formed around my father, who was explaining something with circles in the air. Sabrina posed with a group of friends who knew where to place their chins. Julian laughed with his uncle in the precisely correct proportion. My mother directed an older couple toward the cloakroom. Everyone was doing what the room had asked of them. I went back in. Not everyone noticed. Enough did. A board member angled himself into my path to exchange names and the promise of a call. A reporter I recognized from a byline assessed me as if considering column inches and then pretended to remember a cousin at another table. I handed out 2 cards because 2 were asked for and put the folio back under my arm. Later, much later, when the quartet had been replaced by a playlist that considered itself tasteful and the night had shed some of its posture, I found Sabrina alone for the first time. She stood in the doorway of the anteroom bouquet, retired to a chair, fingers bare of everything but a wedding band that cast its small sun. Does it feel the way you imagined? I asked. She didn't blink at the question. Not exactly, she said, but close enough. That's often the way with precision, I said. She looked at me as if calibrating. I told myself inviting you meant I was generous, she said, then caught the word and cut it down. Magnanimous. That I was over it. And are you? I asked. She considered. For once the answers didn't line up on cue. I am married, she said finally. I am happy. Happiness is a separate measurement, I said. It doesn't cancel what came before. Her shoulders rose and fell like someone remembering a breath they learned long ago. You built a life, she said. You showed up with it. I did, I said. She nodded, a small movement that was more real than anything she'd performed all day. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything, I said. Not tonight. She looked past me toward the hallway, toward her party, toward the staircase that had been built to carry brides. Thank you for coming, she said, and this time the sentence was not tile. It was simply true. Outside again, the air smelled faintly of cut grass and salt. The valet brought the car with ceremony and care. I tipped him, took the wheel, and eased into the cool lanes of the drive. The gatehouse light turned me briefly into a moving shadow on clipped hedges, then let me through. The road back to the hotel ran between portions of my childhood, the field where we'd tried to fly a kite without wind, the corner where my father once explained the concept of case precedent to me, as if bedtime stories had footnotes. My phone buzzed once in my bag and then lay quiet. I didn't reach for it. The night knew its business. In the room, I set this folio on the desk and opened the window to the sound of water striking stone. I took off the dress, folded it along its seams, and laid it on the chair. When I turned off the lamp, the dark settled like a hand that meant no harm. I lay down and let the day unspool behind my eyes, stares, faces the small shift of a weather I didn't have to describe to anyone. Sleep arrived as if it had always known the address. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.